The idea that there's something special about Italian cars didn't come out of nowhere. For about 100 years, manufacturers like Maserati and Alfa Romeo, and of course Ferrari, have made cars that were literally built different. And those people through history who have been wealthy enough to purchase these cars, or talented enough to race them, or both, can attest to this fact. But what if I told you the way in which these companies make cars and handle customers is completely different than what it was in the early years? And this is especially true of Ferrari. Today's story will really highlight this as we look at a specific but important part of Ferrari's early history, and perhaps the strangest Ferrari of all, known as the Uovo, which translated to English means egg. I should note the amazing new book on the Ferrari Uovo by James Page. I'll put a link to it in the description if you guys want to learn more about this story. Also, I'm struggling to pronounce not only this word, but all the words in this video. I want to say Uovo, which is not close. It's something like Uovo. Anyways, it all started with a wealthy and influential and also important Italian family, the Marzottos, or Marzotto, something like that. Known for their success and influence in Italian industry and business, during World War II, as the 14,000 workers in his wool business could have easily been without a job, Gaetano Marzotto propped up his business with his own money to keep them all with work. Gaetano was also a car enthusiast who taught his sons how to drive on their family grounds at a really young age. These boys, Vittorio, Umberto, Giannino, and Paolo, would go on to have incredible careers in racing, in part thanks to their sibling competitiveness. And it didn't take long for their early driving lessons to turn into races, all in their own little cars with chauffeurs present who were probably screaming at them in Italian the whole time. But then quickly, these boys found themselves on the back roads of Italy, really basically street racing each other. At a young age, sometimes too young, the brothers were found in official Italian races like the Mille Miglia, behind the wheel of early Lancias, but it didn't take long for them to outgrow these cars, so they got their hands on Ferrari 166s and began taking on the very best factory racers. Now, Ferrari was somewhat in its infancy as a marque at this point in 1949, having built their first car only a few years earlier. It was already competitive, though, in high-profile races, thanks to its founder Enzo Ferrari, and also thanks to his love affair with the V12 form. The first model out of the factory was the 125, a radical race car, but not exactly successful. Enzo, though, had a way of bringing out the best in his designers and engineers, many of them who were very talented and brilliant, and he got the most out of them by pressuring them, and he would do so again in the updated version of his V12 race car, known as the 166. With this bigger and better V12 car, Ferrari began to take a different approach as a company. Instead of making a handful of race cars, they would also now sell their cars to specific wealthy and influential privateers who were interested in racing, many of which would produce some of the greatest racing families in Italy and help gain Ferrari its worldwide status. The Marzottos would be one such family. And this car was so good and so advanced for its time in terms of engine and chassis design. The high-revving 2-liter V12 made well over 100 horsepower, and the tubular steel chassis provided a good balance of strength and lightness, contributing to the car's ability and performance. Riders like Clemente Biondetti would win the Mille Miglia, leading to the improved 166mm, but it was also successful in everything from hill climbs to international road races. Early on, though, Ferrari was mostly interested in making powerful engines with little focus and not much research into aerodynamics. Still, the 166 didn't follow the form of most early race cars. Ferrari didn't really have a specific design language at this point, but with the later versions of the 166, the look would be quite different than other race cars that were available. Race cars had become increasingly wider at the lower parts of the car, whereas this car had a body which had its widest point around halfway up the car. Still, it was incredibly successful. 1949 would be a really important year for Ferrari, with the 166 taking many international wins, most importantly the Paris 12 Hours. Now, of all the Marzotto brothers, Giannino would have by far the most success in racing, starting in 1950 when he won the treacherous Mille Miglia race aboard a 166mm, the third win in a row for Ferrari at that event, which is really crazy. This was about the time races like the Mille Miglia were becoming increasingly dangerous with fatalities, every single year, almost always involving spectators. And Giannino's win at the age of 22 in 1950 would make him the youngest to ever win the race. This picture of a young, wealthy figure stepping out of his Ferrari Berlinetta in a double-breasted suit, having beaten some of the best drivers in the world, would really help build Ferrari's reputation as an exotic Italian performance car marque. But Giannino and his brother, specifically Vittorio, were frustrated with Ferrari at this point. They'd been learning about a new concept for racing called aerodynamics. The idea that air was actually really the enemy to speed. He felt that the Ferrari V12 engine and chassis were pretty phenomenal, but would often complain to Enzo that his cars weren't living up to their full potential because of their overall shape, but Enzo had little interest in such matters, apparently saying that aerodynamics are for people who can't make proper engines. So the Marzottos took matters into their own hands, buying a few 166s without bodies, and working with some of his close coach-building friends, they managed to make and engineer their own body for this race car. The goal with this one-off race car was really streamlining, which meant getting the front end as low as possible and creating a plane around the car for the air to move. This also meant that the car needed to kind of point down steeply with a steeply sloped windshield. Much of the body design and build can actually be owed to Franco Reggiani, a brilliant engineer who created everything from cars to boats and aircrafts to machines for the baking industry. Anyways, this was a complete and thorough experiment in aerodynamics, really unseen up to this point. They even put the spare tire inside of the car to limit drag. The underside of the car was also almost entirely faired. And as much as this was an advanced experiment in aerodynamics for racing, it was equally a very forward-looking car in its pursuit of weight savings and weight distribution, with the body being made entirely out of lightweight but difficult to shape aluminum alloy and the thin tube frame construction. And Giannino wanted the car to tend towards oversteer, so he put the driver's seat much closer to the rear than what was typical for this time. Enzo liked race cars where the driver was towards the front, but Giannino felt that though it made tight steering more difficult, there was actually more potential for drivers who were able to control it if the driver was towards the back. From some angles, and especially now looking back in light of racing history, this car was in some ways beautiful and aggressive, but from other angles it was kind of odd looking. When the group of young men presented the car to Enzo, he lost his ever-living mind. It wasn't just ugly to him, he thought the car would fall apart in a race. Despite apparently being so sure that the car would fail, he decided to send Piero Taruffi in a works Ferrari race car, determined to destroy Marzotto's creation in the upcoming Giro de Sicilia race. Vittorio and Giannino would both race in their new cars head-to-head against works Ferraris, and Vittorio would actually take the win, overtaking Taruffi close to the finish. After the race, Giannino got in contact with Enzo, who said, "As I had predicted, a Ferrari won." Oh, God. Complications would cause the Uovo to retire early that year at the Mille Miglia, but Giannino would take his first win in the car at the Coppa della Toscana, despite forgetting his driving gloves and suffering massive blisters. Sadly, this race would mark the final event where a Marzotto would race the Uovo, but it wouldn't be the end of the road for this strange car. In the coming years, various racers, both famous and not so famous, would drive the Uovo in major events under the Marzotto brothers' new team, but nobody would be able to get the car to perform quite as well as Giannino and Vittorio. But it had a respectable career. It's important to understand that this was one of the most significant periods in racing in terms of development with Mercedes and their disc brakes and some of the greatest drivers ever. Think the likes of Sterling Moss. And Giannino would actually win the Mille Miglia again in impressive fashion, but not aboard a Uovo. No, the next and longest chapter for this car, interestingly enough, would be in America. This is where it all gets a bit mysterious, but we do know some of the history. It went to Mexico at the end of 1953 for the Carrera Panamericana race, but it wasn't with the Marzottos. We don't really have any records of the car being sold, but most assume it went there with a man named Scuderia Gustal, who had been racing it at this point. What we do know is that it was sold then in Mexico, and long story short, it ended up in the hands of a man named Ignacio Lozano, who brought it to Texas. There it ended up racing in 1954 at the Lone Star sports car races at Bergstrom Air Force Base, where it finished third in its class. It also raced but didn't win in these early years in California. somehow James Dean ended up coming across the car at some point. Not too long after, the car was sold to a former movie star and music producer named David Andrews, who decided that this car didn't need that lame old V12 and actually decided to put an American V8 in it, which was a common practice at this time in America with Ferraris. In 1964, Andrew died and the car ended up in the hands of Harvey Schaub, a Ferrari enthusiast from LA, who began to slowly restore the car as it wasn't in the best shape at this time, but he wouldn't be able to complete the restoration, and the car went to his widow Lucille. Then in 1982, it would be passed on to Jack Dugan, who was based in Florida, and he began a really full-fledged, proper frame-off restoration of the car with the help of Dick Green. Much of the car was missing at this point, so while Dick Green worked on the body, Dugan worked to get all the missing pieces, including, an instrument cluster. Many pieces were custom made using old photos as references. The engine was rebuilt in England by Bob Wallace in hopes of having the car ready to show at the 1986 Mille Miglia. They then sent the complete car over to England to merge everything. This really was a costly restoration, to say the least. The car would go on to be a staple at the Mille Miglia, but it would also be shown in various races and shows and continue to wow people around the world in almost exactly the same way it did in its original showing, because the car, even today, is just as shocking. While the Uovo would eventually leave the racing world, so too would the Marzotto brothers, who eventually took over their family businesses and went on to start their own. And under their ownership, their family textile business became really a global project. They still maintained a close relationship with the automotive world, though, and with the car. Now, one of my main questions when looking at this car and its history was the name. How did the car end up with the name Uovo, or egg? Giannino once described the car as beautifully ugly, which is so fitting. So was he the one who gave it that name, or was it maybe old Enzo himself as a sort of insult? Originally, Giannino actually referred to the car as the Jet, which is cute. Sure, he was trying to make an aerodynamic race car, so that's a fitting name in theory, but the car looks a heck of a lot more like an egg than it does a jet. The truth is, we don't know when or how this nickname was given to the car, but we do know that it was pretty early on. It didn't take long for everyone to be calling it the Uovo. For me, the story of this car is really an interesting look into the very earliest days of Ferrari, showing their relentless focus on racing, but also brilliant business move to decide to partner with wealthy enthusiasts. A business model that has maybe been taken a bit too far today, but I think that's up for debate. I just can't get Jay Leno's sentiment about Ferrari out of my head, to the point where, honestly, I don't even know if I would have much interest in owning a Ferrari, which is sad. I'd be a perfect potential Ferrari customer. But it is interesting to see these early enthusiasts who were bold enough to challenge Enzo, which I guess is what you get for working with highly successful, wealthy, often Italians. But more than anything, this car left its mark on the history of race cars because of what it was and what the Marzottos were trying to accomplish with it. At the end of his amazing book, James Page notes that the main point of the Uovo was to improve the Ferrari race cars in regards to weight savings and aerodynamics, and at that point he says that Giannino said Ferraris were as heavy as trucks, which is just funny to hear someone say that about Ferraris, but I think he was right. And even though the Uovo didn't win everything, it was an incredibly early attempt at a full-blown aerodynamics and weight savings program, unlike anything before it, and it was done by a privateer, which would end up being a trend in the history of racing. Knowledgeable racers taking matters into their own hands and often outperforming the best that the factory teams could produce with a lot less money. Think the likes of Jack Brabham and Bruce McLaren and Carroll Shelby and even Enzo Ferrari himself. Sometimes the racers have a better understanding of the cars than the factory, and in this case, the individuals had the money and time and wherewithal to take matters into their own hands. Despite its modest racing career, the Uovo's impact on automotive design and engineering was really significant. The car's aerodynamic bodywork and lightweight construction influenced not only race cars and cars in general, but just how we view performance as a whole. It's always going to be a twofold project of more power, less weight, and good aerodynamics. But even future Ferrari models were influenced, as it really did demonstrate the potential benefits of more aerodynamic and lightweight design in motorsports. The Uovo remains a highly valued and celebrated piece of Ferrari history, hence the reason the car just sold for $4.5 million. it's known more for its unique appearance and engineering than its racing victories. I think the main lesson is that new innovations for race cars aren't always appealing at first. Not every car can just be beautifully aerodynamic, like the way that, say, the Jaguar C, D, and E types were. I look at a car like the Uovo and I think, that's odd looking, but it's also oddly beautiful. But at its inception, I think people just thought, that's weird. Like, it was just too different. And, this has been the case for most new ideas in regards to aerodynamics in the pursuit of speed. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this story and this look into a specific but important part of Ferrari and Italian racing history. Make sure to subscribe if you like these kinds of stories, and we'll see you in the next one. Drive safe.